intersection with religious Muslim. In addition to being our program development coordinator, where he tries to secure as many opportunities for us to continue this work. Ray possesses a wealth of knowledge on researching religious identity, and most importantly, he's set to defend his doctoral thesis next week. So good luck to you, Ray. I'm sorry, I had to do it. I also want to introduce to you all Saurav. He's one of the moderators for today. So please, over to you.
Oops, here's Weiwei. Melis, if you want to introduce Weiwei as well.
Oh, absolutely. I didn't even see happen over here. Hi, Weiwei. It's a pleasure to see you. I'm so sorry. My screen cut out. So also, let me introduce Weiwei for a moment. I met Weiwei, like most other people during the pandemic, over a WhatsApp group that ICRD's Vice President, Martine Miller, had put together for a few colleagues and friends to stay in touch with remote work. So I'm really grateful for that connection opportunity to have met you. Weiwei boasts an impressive academic and professional achievements. She's first and foremost a human rights advocate for the rights of women and marginalized populations. After having spent 7 years as a political prisoner in her home country of Myanmar, Weiwei has founded 2 organizations, first of which is the Women's Peace Network, which builds on peace and mutual understanding between Myanmar's ethnic communities and empowers marginalized women throughout Myanmar, particularly the Rohingya and the Rakhine State. The other is the Yangon Youth Center, a space where young people from diverse backgrounds can come together to learn, share, and explore ideas to promote leadership in peace-building policymaking. So thank you, Weiwei, for having joined us today at this time. Please go ahead, Saurav.
Thank you. Thank you, Melis. Hi, everyone. As Melis said, my name is Saurav Upadhyay. I'm the research manager for learning and evaluation at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. Today's conversation, which we are so grateful to be hosting with our colleagues at ICRD, is part of AFP's Effective Interreligious Action in Peacebuilding portfolio. Effective interreligious action in peacebuilding is a core organizational conviction for AFP, and through this portfolio and through, for example, hosting exchanges and conversations like this, we work to support, amplify, learn from, advocate for, advocate with faith actors, faith communities, and faith and interfaith organizations involved in peacebuilding. So if you are a faith actor or work for a faith organization involved in peacebuilding, we would love to hear from you and learn from you, and if possible, help support and amplify your work. I will drop my email in the chat if you want to continue having this conversation later. And speaking of the chat, please use that function to tell us who you are and where you are joining from. And also let us know about what the rise of exclusionary nationalism looks like in your context and what your organizations are doing to navigate this issue. If you want to introduce yourself to everyone, please toggle to the everyone in the drop-down menu on the chat so that you can reach everyone and not just the hosts and the panelists. And also, if you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A tab to post the questions. I'll be monitoring the chat. That's my sort of role as a moderator today, and the Q&A. And I'll pose the questions and share your comments with the panelists. So just wanted to share that. Over to you, Melis.
All right, thank you. So my name is Melis Sosa. I'm a program assistant at ICRD. I usually work on programs kind of unrelated to nationalism. I work on programs in the Sahel on informal religious education, and another in the Maldives on the rehabilitation and reintegration of former terrorist fighters. So while my experience on nationalism or religious nationalism is nowhere near that of our participants today, a core principle of what we've been doing at ICRD over the past few years, in addition to working on social cohesion, conflict, PVE and CVE work, is we've been trying to grow our internal capacities for reflection, improvement, and connection with other people in our network, other peace builders, kind of trying to learn from everyone. And so this spirit of collaboration and reflection and growth is kind of really ingrained into ICRD now. And this is the whole purpose of this webinar. We've allied ourselves with Alliance for Peacebuilding, and we want to host a space where everyone can share, learn from each other, and grow our knowledge and our ability to help out. And so thank you all for having come to this webinar. And please think of this as our first pilot run. So we'll see how it goes. And I'm really excited for this conversation and to learn from you all today. So the conversation will be in a roundtable format, as Saurav mentioned. I hope to get all of the participants to answer some of the questions that we have. And now I think it might be time to start, unless any of the panelists would like to add anything that I may have missed of your introductions or that you would like to highlight for us. Perfect. Okay. If that's all right, Catherine, I think that we would like to start with you. So, due to your book and all of the research that you've done over the past decades, would you mind giving us an overview? Can you talk about what is driving nationalism in the US and around the world as well, some of the correlations that you've seen? What can you tell us about the key actors and the characters in this movement that you've been able to research?
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to be here. I want to thank ICRD and the Alliance for Peacebuilding for putting this together. And I want to thank all of you tuning in. Just looking at the chat, I see there are folks from all over the world, and I'm just grateful for your interest in this really important topic, this vital topic today. I want to start by talking about what religious nationalism is in America and also what it's not. In the US specifically, the form of religious nationalism that we have and that's sort of exerting more and more influence in our politics is Christian nationalism. So that's how I'm going to refer to it. But it's important to note that Christian nationalism is not a religion. It is not Christianity. It is not evangelicalism. It is a political ideology that exploits religion for political purposes. Its representatives insist that the foundation of legitimate government in the United States is bound up with a reactionary understanding of a particular religion, their interpretation of religion. So it's an anti-democratic movement. It's anti-pluralistic, anti-equality. It basically says that the United States is founded on the Bible, as they understand it, and can succeed only if it stays true to this foundation. Christian nationalism is also a device for mobilizing and manipulating large segments of the population by getting them to vote for certain political candidates and thereby concentrating power in the hands of a new elite. I want to say something else about what the movement is not. I said it's not evangelicalism. It certainly includes many evangelicals, but it excludes many evangelicals as well, and it includes representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion. And what unites the movement is not a distinct theology, but a common political vision. Religious nationalism in the US, as elsewhere, makes use of religion, exploits religion, but it's not just trying to achieve religious, social, or cultural aims. It's trying to achieve political power. Its leaders want really three things. They want power for themselves, and their political allies. They want policies that favor certain approved groups in society and disfavor others. They promote this idea that there's a sort of a correct group in society that's deserving of respect and privileges, and other groups that are worthy of contempt. And they also want public funding of their initiatives, their religious initiatives, and they want economic policies that are favorable to the movement's plutocratic funders, I think, to plutocratic donors. I think to a largely underappreciated degree that calls for quote unquote religious liberty that characterize that the way the leaders of this movement characterize it these days are actually a demand for public funding of their initiatives. Religious nationalism everywhere in the US and all over the world divides nations to identify insiders versus outsiders, the pure versus the impure. And they do this to exert greater control over the population and persuade their supporters to back wildly regressive agendas in every area. And it's really important to note that, this is a leadership-driven movement. In America, it's not driven by the rank and file. When you're talking about the rank and file, you have a wide range of people with a lot of concerns and anxieties and preoccupations. And many of them, are when they're voting for the candidate who promises to end abortion or defend the traditional family, they're really not aiming for major changes in the way our government is run. They're really making a statement about who they are and what they value in themselves. But for the leaders of the movement, it's not just about those culture war issues. It's about a broad range of economic, social, and even international policies. So who are they? In the United States, so it's a leadership-driven movement. It's also organization-driven. And the strength of the movement, the reason why it has so much power and force is because there's this dense organizational infrastructure that has been built up over decades. I'm going to describe components briefly of this infrastructure. We don't have long, so I'm going to keep it a little brief. But I will throw out a few names. I just want you to know this list of names is by no means complete. I get into the sort of various components in much, much more detail in my book, The Power Worshippers. So the infrastructure of the movement includes right-wing policy groups like the Family Research Council, the Family Research Council and Heritage, and Focus on the Family. There's legal advocacy organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which plays a role in almost every Supreme Court case that is intended to degrade the separation of church and state. You have other organizations like Liberty Council or Pacific Justice Institute or the ACLJ that are also aligned with their vision. In the legal sphere, you have the Federalist Society, which plays a role, a very strong role in grooming, funding, and promoting right-wing candidates for the judiciary, those who contain the sort of, who have this sort of supposedly correct ideologies. You have leadership training initiatives, such as the Leadership Institute, that trains a lot of the political leaders and also a lot of the faith leaders that the movement relies upon. You've got legislative initiatives like the Congressional Prayer Caucus's Project Blitz and Americans United for Life. These legislative initiatives will craft model legislation and then send it out through state legislatures, multiple state legislatures at the same time, knowing full well that some of these legislative initiatives will fail, but it'll move the ball down the road and some of them will break through. And they're very successful with that. You've got think tanks like the Acton Institute that plays a role, or Mackinac Center, pastoral organizations like Watchmen on the Wall and Faith Wins, which get pastors on the same page. Watchmen on the Wall, for instance, has tens of thousands of affiliated pastors. And then networking organizations such as the Council for National Policy that get the leadership on the same page and bring them together with the movement's plutocratic donors. And of course, the movement relies on a vast far-right messaging sphere, or as I sometimes think of it, as a propaganda sphere. It does a really great job of separating a large subsection of the American electorate, the American population, from the facts, which makes them easier to control. So if you can get people to believe a lot of little lies, you can get them to believe a big lie. And the movement is really good at doing that. So I want to make a point, which is that in America, large numbers of churches, our faith landscape is incredibly vibrant and diverse, precisely because we've had the separation of church and state, where the government should not favor nor disfavor any particular religion, but generally the government is meant to, and religion are meant to operate in, into separate spheres in a way. And so pastors are not supposed to endorse political candidates from the pulpit. But that has effectively been kind of vetoed on the ground. It's in effect, large numbers of houses of worship in America have been transformed effectively into partisan political cells. Leaders of the movement know very well, if you can get the pastors, you can get their members of their congregations. So they draw these pastors into networks like Watchmen on the Wall or Faith Wins, which I mentioned earlier, and they give them they hold presentations in swing districts and swing states, and they get them into they give them very sophisticated tools, including data tools, very precise data tools, messaging materials, voter guides, and all these other features that they can use to activate their congregations to vote for the candidates who represent supposedly biblical values and who are favorable to the movement leaders. I think it's fair to say that in an earlier era, the Republican Party of the United States saw value in exploiting America's I would say, what they called hyper-conservative Christians, or today's religious nationalists. They sort of thought, the Republican Party of an earlier era thought, okay, well, we can get them to vote for us because They're hyper loyal base, they're reliable voters, and we'll exploit them without really giving them what they want. But now the tables have really been turned and the party has become captured by the movement and is frankly beholden to it. Now, of course, every political party tries to accumulate power, and nothing is as useful to a political party as a solid and hyper-loyal base. But we can't overlook the fact that religious nationalism has always in the past and in the present been a way of uniting people less around a love for some particular identity than for hatred of others. You know, it's a means by which people feel free to express their contempt for those who are different, for the outsiders, the impure, supposedly impure. So paranoia is one of the defining features of this movement. And this paranoia often manifests in a kind of persecution complex. And recognizing that paranoia and persecution complex is absolutely essential to recognizing religious nationalism in America today. I think we also have to note too that religious nationalism in practice almost never comes to an end in a genuine theocracy, and it certainly won't result in a Christian democracy. Its natural destination is a kleptocracy led by irrational, often nepotistic leaders in which organized hypocrisy takes the place of religion. Rather than uniting populations, such governments tend to deepen existing divides. They divide. Leaders of the groups, they turn to conservative religious leaders to support and mask their own failures, a lack of a popular mandate, a lack of popular support for the things that they want to do. They jail journalists or worse, and they literally demonize their political opponents and their supporters. I was listening the other day, just have to mention this, to Russian state television. One of the talk show hosts was talking about Ukrainians. He said, they are little devils, they are demonic, they are godless, and you good Orthodox soldiers, you need to finish them off. This is the language of genocide, and it has preceded and accompanied some of the most tragic and appalling chapters in our history, in the history of the world. So wherever this type of religious nationalist rhetoric arises, I think we should all be deeply concerned. And today, my view is that America's Christian nationalism represents a grave threat to our democracy. Fundamentally, the doctrines of religious nationalism reinforce authoritarianism, the authority of scripture for sure, but also the authority, the absolute authority of elected, approved religious and political leaders. And this is what religious nationalisms do around the world. Their doctrines insist on obedience to a literalist or strict interpretation of the faith, but this is very handy for both the clerics and the politicians and the elites that they serve, as it reinforces power and privilege. So when leaders like Putin in Russia, or I think of Modi in India, or political leaders in places like Iran, bind themselves to religious ultra-conservative leaders to consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power, we rightly recognize this as a form of as forms of religious nationalism. And again, they use this to masquerade their own failures, their nepotism, their kleptocracy, and to exert tighter and more authoritarian control of their populations. So I don't want to speak too long. I want to leave plenty of time to hear from the other panelists. And I'm really grateful for your presence today and really glad to be in conversation with all of you.
Catherine, that was really great. Thank you. So we could have had a whole conversation on many of the points that you touched up on, whether it's in the US or the presentation of nationalism kind of all over the world and how we can extrapolate that. But so thank you for that really comprehensive kind of overview of your work and your thoughts on the subject. And I want to continue with, with some of gearing towards the practitioners in the group. If you all can also talk about what the rise of nationalism looks like in your country's context, and how is rising nationalism impacting you and your organization's peacebuilding work? Because at the end of the day, we're all peacebuilding organizations, whether we work with religion or not. And so Panuga, I would like to start with you. And as I mentioned, you're kind of living in the issue right now with the candidacy of Marine Le Pen. And so how is that impacting Coexiste's work? If you'd be able to speak to that for a moment.
Thank you, Maëlys, and thank you so much for SCRD and AFP for the invitation. I'm really glad to be part of this panel on discussing nationalism, which is a very, I think, becoming a global issue, sadly, but it also has particular effects in France as well. And as you mentioned, Maëlys, and also Saurabh, that we're currently undergoing a presidential election that's yet again brought the far right in the second round of the elections, with 23% of the votes for Marine Le Pen, whose party embodies the nationalist discourse in France. She somehow rendered this discourse and the messaging of the party more palatable in comparison to her father's time. And this presidential race was particularly, was different from the one 5 years ago, because we've seen a polarization of discourse around immigration, but also religious minority, especially the Muslim minority, presented and repeatedly presented by different candidates as a threat to what they call a so-called French civilization. And I'm putting red flags around that specific expression, because it also is an expression that is very monolithic and doesn't really say much about the diversity of what France represents and is. And this particular stance was embodied and rendered audible by the rise of the far-right pundit Éric Zemmour, who also ran a presidential campaign and ended up scoring 7% of the votes, which is also a worrying trend in terms of how much nationalist discourses are taking a stance and a kind of grip on French society as well. So in this perspective, we're navigating a very deeply polarized society, with one part of the society feeling the sense of exclusion, excluded from globalization, or not having seen or dealt too much of diversity in the surrounding, and believing a discourse that somehow comforts their worldviews. So there is this, as Catherine mentioned, there's an image of a foreigner threatening their existence. And given the history of France with the Second World War and the collaboration regime, nationalism takes a bit more of an insidious form here. Also because less people are familiar with the history of France and that particular side of history that is also being distorted by different candidates and people. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of pointers as to what nationalism can look like in France. And as I was saying, it's a little bit more insidious here. So it was historically embodied, and it still is embodied by a political party, which was formerly known as the Front National and is now known as the Rassemblement National. This party was created in the 70s to gather all far-right forces and invest the political arena and contest elections. So that was the first kind of aim. And their ideas, the ideas of that particular party was always been anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, negationist, and denying the Jewish genocide as well. And so there was the core ideas of that party. And they also developed this idea of what they call national preference, in French, préférence nationale. So it's basically the idea of giving a preference to what they are considering people that are French by birth and by birth, but not really the people that came in France later on. So that nationalism takes that political form through that party, but it's also embodied through ideologies and also conspiracy theories that were reprised during this campaign as well. And so I can cite one that was very much used and mentioned in the media, that is called the theory of the Great Replacement, or théorie du grand remplacement in French. And this theory is also pretty much takes from the far right, the political far right, but goes much more further in its argumentation and reasoning, is that France is seemingly facing an imminent threat of being completely replaced by immigrants and Muslims and people from sub-Saharan Africa. And so these specific group are seemingly posing a threat to French civilization. Again, caution on the use of that expression as well. And so that theory has been used by Zemmour and also some of the people that are part of the traditional right as well. And so this is also an ideological expression of nationalism here that is seeped into the political sphere. And the one thing that is very, very surprising or slowly, gradually taking more and more importance here is the fact that they're getting closer to power, as we can see with the elections, but also they're given more platform to express their idea compared to more progressive movements. So that also raises other questions as to what is heard instead and what is given more preference to in terms of what we're hearing in the media, which was also a very big issue here in terms of who was given more time on TV in terms of ideas and programs for the elections, but more generally as well, like ideas. The other aspect of this is, of course, the rise of violent and hateful rhetorics, which is a consequence of all of that, but linked as well. The normalization of violent and hateful rhetorics in the public sphere without specific legal political condemnations. And so in a recent study that was conducted by 2 French MEPs, there were more than 1,600 anti-religious acts that were registered, among which more than 800 were registered against Christian people and all places of worship. More than 500 were directed against Jewish people and or places of worship, and more than 200 were directed against Muslim people and all places of worship. And these numbers are very likely to be underestimated. So these ideologies, this rhetoric is also very direct and material and physical consequences to people as well, and specifically religious minorities, but not only. And in that perspective, because Coexiste works on specifically youth, it is a youth organization that works with people from 15 to 35. And the aim is to create space and engagement for interfaith work through volunteership at the local level. So there is that we are dealing with the issue of funding as well. In general, youth organizations are less funded in France than other countries in the EU. And so funding specifically has been an issue. Public funding, I'm saying, has been an issue because there's also the idea that peace building work is not a priority, a political priority here because we're not at war. So to kind of shape the discourse or change the discourse is one challenge that we're facing in terms of making public officials understand that war is not necessarily something that involves arms, but also starts with ideas, acts, violence that start way before that. Is a discourse that is not yet heard by public officials. So that also affects the funding because we have to kind of write project proposals that have to kind of match the political priorities at the moment. And the other aspect of how the way nationalism has formed and risen and is also affecting our work is the fact that because we're dealing with interfaith work, we're also dealing with the notion of secularism that is called laïcité in France. And so the term of laïcité refers to the way in which religion is regulated in the public and private sphere, and the law of 1905 on separation of churches and state that specifically removed the control and funding of the state from churches. And because of this, the assassination of Samuel Paty in 2020, this notion is seeing a difference in the interpretation from the government with a more restrictive interpretation that the law was intended in 1905. And there is a view that laïcité should be confined to the private sphere, and Coexiste is advocating for the intended version of laïcité, historical version, and the historical interpretation of that notion that is also conflicting with what the government is advocating towards more. And so these kind of aspects are challenging how we can actually put forward our advocacy and our method of work to counter rise of hateful speech, but also and work towards peace building as well. And these have been the kind of trends that we've been seeing here so far.
That's great. Thank you, Panuga, for having spoken on. You brought up a lot of things that I think about and how nationalism or the rise of nationalism impacts our work. There's the issue, as you mentioned, France's particular laws on media laws and how much attention you can give to certain political candidates that are quite different from the US, but nonetheless, media attention and how much attention and how the media can speak as to certain ideas and certain candidates and how much it can put it forward really differs across countries. The amount of funding that peace building organizations get, whether they're religious or not, depends on, the government and the priorities that they have. So I'm really glad that you brought up all of those things. And to that point, Weiwei, I wanted to go to you next. And if you could speak about, how the rise of nationalism has impacted your work in your country. And I know that you and your family come from, a line of activists, and that you all have kind of been in this field for a while. And so if there's any, historical points that you can either compare, contrast, or show the evolution of nationalism in the space that you work in, I think that'd be really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mylis. It's an honor to join you guys today, and thank you for the invitation. When we talk about, I guess, okay, I'm dealing with my computer issue. That's why I was late. Apology for that. Let me try to turn it off. Oh, sorry. All right. Hopefully it will work today. So I guess when we talk about nationalism or racism in a radical form of nationalism in relation to race and ethnicity, I think all of these words are quite generic, and all of these are, I guess, it doesn't actually happen by itself in all of the contexts. It's actually, it has always a motivating factors as well as individuals and institutions involved. And in the case of Myanmar, when we talk about nationalism, there are many forms of nationalism that we could identify throughout the history. Like when Burma was like under the kingdoms and Burmese kingdoms before the British colonies, it was nationalism against other kingdoms or neighbors. And during the British colonial period, it was nationalism against the British colony. And the independence movement and leaders used that nationalism against the colony to fight against the British, and so that we gained the independence. We may have perceived this sort of nationalism as a positive nationalism. But after the independence, the way that people perceive nationalism and believe nationalism has shifted because there are actors involved, specifically the military in Myanmar. So military was part of the key part of the independent movement. The Burmese military was a key part of the independent movement in early 1940s. And then once we gained independence in 1948, the role of military became a crucial part of Burmese politics. And the way that military institutions see themselves and position themselves it's quite concerning or quite controversial. The military institutions in Myanmar see themselves as the guardians of the country, and they should be a key driver for the Burmese politics. With that mindset, the military has actually, the military institution as an institutions and led by different leaders has been controlling the country with many forms of coups and military dictatorship for over the past 6-7 decades. However, we have a short periods of two democracy or quasi-democracy period since the independence in 1948. About 20 years of, quasi, semi, or a sort of democracy period. Apart from that, it was always military having full control over the country. But then, as we all know, the nature of military systems or military dictatorship is always repressive, and there are always people who want to defy against the military dictatorships and bring democracy. And there has always been democracy movement in Myanmar. So for the military, for the purpose of controlling the country, they need some sort of unity or support and belief from the society. from the public. So what they have done successfully is that seeding the ethnic and religious nationalism among the people. Among the people, I mean, among Buddhist Burmese. So the way that the military has seeded the ground was basically promoting Buddhist Burman superiority, supremacism, and basically promoting like a form, a nationalism that has to do with the religion, Buddhism, and being Burman ethnicity. So in a different forms, through the different methods and approaches, by practice, by policies, by institutional structures, as well as many other mediums like broadcasting and etc. If you are Buddhist and if you're Burman and they're pure Burmese, then you are a pure Burmese and you belong to this country and you are entitled to the country more than any others, and you will be treated as such. Although they will attack or they will target you if you actually go after the military's policies. Otherwise, you are safe and you are superior and you're a privileged class. And that mindset has been seeded for over several decades. And it was in 2012 when we had this democracy transitions. And that's where the military felt more insecure and they started to see a need to utilize this Buddhist Burman purity, concept of Buddhist Burman purity and Buddhist Burman nationalism to gain popularity. And they use that and they incite, by using that, they incite violence against Muslim and violence against specifically the Rohingya. That's how they gain momentum and support from the public, and that's how they manage to commit genocide in Myanmar. So that's the context in Myanmar. My organization was founded in 2012, 2013, aftermath of this violence attack against the Rohingya and Muslims in general, when the hate, anti-Muslim, anti-Rohingya hate campaign was picked by the military as a whole and by the religious Buddhist monk and religious leaders. Part of our goal was to basically reduce the radical Buddhist nationalism or racism and hate campaign against the other religious and ethnic minority groups, as such Rohingya and Muslim in general, and other religion. There were hate campaign and hate speech against the Christianity and Chinese and etc. Those who are not pure Burman or Buddhists are considered as a second class or outsiders or aliens, and we try to counter those narrative and those concept, ideology, and the propaganda through different activities. So part of our organizational goal was like basically to reduce hate and to change public mindset, and it was challenging because we had to be very careful. We can be easily targeted and singled out and attacked by the both nationalist people, nationalist groups, as well as by the military institution. So we had very limited space and very limited resources, and it was extremely challenging to really come up with a strategy that wouldn't put our staffers and our people who work with at risk. So yeah, even the choices of what, the choices of campaign, the way of communication, we had to be very strategic. And I guess at the end of the day, it might not address, I think, for it might not necessarily, we might not necessarily be able to stop the genocide, but yet we were able to promote and change mindset of the young people. Today, after the military coup, a lot of young people that we work with in fighting against the nationalism and countering hate and racism, they are like leading figures in the pro-democracy movement now. So I must say that we make some impact, but it was a challenging one. But I think we need more effort and more strategic approach to this kind of situation.
That was really awesome to listen to, Wei Wei. I really, all of the historical context that you and Panuga have shared have really helped put kind of this contemporary setting of rising nationalism into better context. And, even if it's in different places of the world with different actors, the same core themes of exclusion and, supremacy over various intra and outer groups just kind of keeps on coming back up. So it's interesting to see those all tied together. And quickly, before we go on to our next, well, not quickly, actually, please take your time. But before the next set of questions, Ray, I also wanted to ask you to kind of complete this first set of responses that we've had. If you could also speak to how, what are your impressions about, relating to what Catherine said on the US side, but what about what does the rise of nationalism look like in Christian communities in the US, and what has been the impact on congregations and clergies? You've researched this a lot for us at ICRD, so if you could impart some of your wisdom, that'd be lovely.
I had prepared remarks and everything, but after hearing what was just shared by Catherine, Wei Wei, and Nuga, like my brain is like going in like 100 different places right now. And I'm gonna try to reorganize my thoughts but still kind of tie back to things that were said earlier and shared by other panelists. One general kind of, I want to start with the general point about nationalism, and I think Wei Wei just brought this up very well in just in the Myanmar context, right? That there are many forms of nationalism, and I think that's true around the world. And without getting into the weeds of like historical and scholarly debates about how to define it, I think it's simple to say, it's enough to say that there is no consensus about what nationalism is that everybody subscribes to, but it's one of those things which is tricky. It's like when you see it, you know it, right? And so we all have a kind of a visceral or intuitive understanding of what nationalism is, but it's really hard to parse out what exactly is it, how exactly does it work and manifest, and like what kind of flavor does it take up and what kind of characteristic it takes up, right? And so I think it's really important to have a panel like this where we're talking about looking at nationalism from so many different angles, because I think we need to constantly be shifting our gaze, because it as with all human dynamics, it's growing and evolving live in real time, and so we need to constantly be recalibrating and relooking and re-examining our notions of what nationalism is. And another point is that Wei Wei just brought up, that different times we think about nationalism as a good thing, and sometimes we look at it as a bad thing, right? And I think it's fundamentally tied to power dynamics. When it's a minority nation or a group of people who are mobilizing around national identity to fight against imperial powers and colonial powers, we champion that. But when said group, then throughout history, we've seen this, turns the power dynamic on other minorities once they have found, secured their borders or found safety or security. That's when it can get problematic. And so nationalism in and of itself may not be a bad thing, or it's at least morally ambiguous, but it's what people do with it that can often become very problematic. And right now, no one will fault the Ukrainians for rallying behind Ukraine and the Ukrainian nationalism against Russian aggression. No one will fault them for that. But what is qualitatively different, right, about that kind of nationalism and the more insidious kinds of nationalism that we're seeing across the world? And it is worth kind of taking a pause and like thinking about that as well. In the American context, I would say broadly speaking, and also with kind of my conversations and interviews with various pastors throughout the country, what's being kind of seen across the board is this kind of romantic vision of the past, right? And it is tied to what Panuga briefly mentioned about the Great Replacement, right? But it is this romantic vision of a past identity, which is also coupled with a fear of an eroded national sovereignty due to globalization. And I think that's another important point, that this is that there's an element of anti-globalization or anti-global backlash that's driving a lot of these nationalist movements, not just in the US, but also around the world as well. I was watching recordings and videos of right after the January 6th insurrection, the Capitol riots, and there were a lot of speakers who kind of preceded the storming of the Capitol, and some of their favorite talking points among that the election was stolen was George Soros and the globalists are out to get us. The George Soros and the globalists are trying to deceive us, right? And there's also an element of a dog whistle there about like the anti-Semitic Jewish cabal notion that is also running underneath that layer as well, that we shouldn't forget. But there is that kind of anti-globalist backlash and reaction against it, because they see with globalization comes these kinds of other sets of policies like multiculturalism, diversity, inclusion, which is again driving a lot of fears and concerns on the ground. And like when you see the data of who came to the January 6th insurrection, it was at least the people who were arrested and charged, a lot of their hometowns are people who traveled from primarily blue states that have seen in small cities that have seen rapid demographic shifts. So imagine it used to be a small, sleepy town, but then suddenly a big supermarket chain comes in, or a factory gets built, a Tesla factory or something. And then suddenly you get 2,000, 2,500 Central Americans who come in there, and it completely changes the feel of the town. And for those residents, that is disturbing, and they feel that as an existential threat to their way of life, right? Or at least that's what's being told to them also, right? And that's another point that I think Catherine brought up earlier, that this is a very leadership-driven movement. And with that comes it is also driven by an international media environment with key, I would say, discursive media personalities, right? And I'm going to name Tucker Carlson as one of them. Like he absolutely is. Like he casually brings up Great Replacement theory, like on mainstream broadcast news. 2 days ago, I think he started this whole series on masculinity in America and how masculinity in America is being eroded. But he is propping up another kind of media personality called raw egg nationalist, right? And so they go hand in hand now with some of this more mainstream right-leaning news outlets and media personalities parroting some of these talking points that have not been so mainstream, but now it's in the broader consciousness, right? And so it is definitely, these talking points and these fear-mongering is absolutely directed, and there's a lot of energy behind it and money being put into propagating that kind of message, right? Last point I would say is that the US has a distinctly Protestant inflection to the Christian nationalism. And I want to echo or reiterate Catherine's point that this doesn't mean that only Protestants are involved in this, right? I just mean Protestant inflection in terms of kind of the symbology, the rhetoric, the language that's being used, because and this mythology about a Judeo-Christian kind of background, right? And then I think that's interesting to distinguish from what we might observe in, let's say, France, for example, right? And Panuga, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just, whereas in European countries, because they have a different relationship with Christianity and Christian kingdoms and monarchies and things like that, you can say that Christianity exists as a cultural phenomenon in a lot of European states, but in the US, this Protestant inflection isn't simply about like practical means, but it's a matter of belief, and that's why you see such high levels of QAnon believers among certain religious groups in the US, right? And because QAnon is very effectively using prophecy, the end times, a hero to deliver us from our plight, Donald Trump as this King Cyrus, right? All of this religious undertones and overtones, it's very compelling, and it is something that is unique, and I would say, yeah, distinct to the Christian nationalism in the US. And I would say that whereas the ends that are being sought after by Christian nationalists in Europe are more practical, right? It can be framed as like Islam and immigrants versus European nationals, right? Or European nationals versus the globalists. In the US, there is this kind of moral inflection to everything that's being told. And then there's like a cosmic framework about we are trapped in a battle, a struggle for our soul of the nation, about good and evil. And this kind of teases back out, you know, Catherine, you talked about pure and impure, even Wei, you know, you said positive and negative, good and bad. And I think this is at the heart of what nationalists drive, or what's driving the political theory behind nationalism, right? And you can say like Carl Schmitt versus John Rawls. John Rawls is a proponent of the overlapping consensus, you know, that politics should be used to figure out, solve common problems, even though we disagree about the solutions, but nonetheless come to some consensus. Nationalists are more about a Carl Schmitt kind of way about politics should be to figure out who is us and who is them, and make sure we survive them. And so if you have a political theory that is so diametrically opposed like that, I think it does create some interesting challenges for those who work in the peace building field, where we fundamentally operate with the motive to find consensus and bring people together. But how do you have that dialogue with people who come from such diametrically opposed political theories, right? So I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Right, that was quite a perfect segue into, you know, the things that I wanted to touch on next. And I realized that we're getting quite close to 11, and so I will. I understand that some participants may have to leave. I know that it is still only a Wednesday, and we're in the middle of our respective weeks everywhere. But kind of relating back to all the points that you all have made, you know, there's the basis of peace building. I think that we can safely say we all operate on dialogue and cohesion and building bridges and trying to, you know, mitigate gaps, whether it's, you know, difference of political opinions, beliefs, religious identity, and coming to a more flourishing society altogether, regardless of the difference in opinion that we may find there. And so the rise of nationalism, you know, as Panuga very, you know, clearly pointed out in technical means, has, you know, been a challenge to organizations such as ours, you know, whether it's in terms of funding, whether it's in terms of, you know, credence given by grant making organizations, whether it's, you know, support of people that actually would want to work with us and the rest. And so, you know, you all have some very wonderful experience. And Catherine, I know you're not necessarily a practitioner in the field, same as us, but I'd still love to get all of your thoughts. And I think that if we can dedicate maybe 5 minutes to each person, I wanted to ask you all, I mean, just very specifically and concisely, you know, what are the responses that you're seeing to tackle this phenomenon of rising nationalism in your countries, whether it is, you know, of the religious sort or the rest? You know, for us practitioners, how have you seen your organizations or your fellow peacemaking actor networks go about this? Catherine, how are you seeing other political actors, media, journalists, authors such as yourself? How is your network responding and trying to, you know, dissuade this rising nationalism?
And if I may, sorry, if I may interrupt really quickly. A couple of threads that I that I can definitely draw on for that is Wei mentioning like focusing on youth. I think that's such an important element that has already been drawn into this conversation that we need to sort of, lean on, focus on building the capacity of our youth to address this issue. Another one that I definitely want to like get your thoughts on and also comment on really quickly is this idea of, I think, being deeply reflective of what the drivers are. Like, I think that's such an important part of the peace building process that often gets overlooked. we just run straight into programming or project without reflecting on, okay, well, what is the drivers? Who are the key actors? What are some capacities that we can leverage? Who can we reach? So I think those two threads have already been kind of drawn in this conversation. But yeah, I would love again more responses to that.
Well, I'll start. Thank you so much for that really important question. There's so much to say because there's so much activity going on all these different levels. First, I want to say that some of the most, I would say they're very powerful faith voices that are opposed to religious nationalism in the United States. I'm thinking just offhand, groups like the Baptist Joint Committee that has a sort of Christians Against Christian Nationalism project, Red Letter Christians, Vote Common Good. There's so many other organizations in the faith sphere, interfaith organizations like Interfaith America that are doing really important work. But listen, this is a political movement in America. It's not just a set of stances in the culture wars or just a articulation of ideologies. So since this is a political problem, a lot of the solutions are political as well. And I think groups that are engaged in voting rights, because this is a movement that's allied with politicians that are trying to curtail voting rights rather than expand them or give people fair access to them. So I think voting rights organizations are really important. Anti-corruption organizations, because there's a lot of sort of nepotism, I should say, and kleptocracy involved in some of the elements of the previous administration, and folks that are trying to sort of bring that to light and trying to hold perpetrators to account. That's very important. All of the radical right is investing in all of the features of modern political campaigns, as I outlined earlier, and I outline at length in my book, the policy groups, the legal groups, all of those sort of tools are available to those of us who reject the politics of conquest and division that this movement represents. And there are a lot of folks trying to engage the courts to the extent possible, engage with legislative initiatives to the extent possible, engage in policy making and policy groups to the extent that they can. So I see so many avenues for engagement. I remember, over the past dozen years plus, I've been attending these right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings and summits. That's how I do a lot of my research, is by going to the places where they are, where the leadership is gathering, and having conversations about what they're doing and what they're going to do. And I remember one of the very astute and seasoned strategists. His name is Ralph Reed. He has an organization called Faith and Freedom Coalition. He's been involved in the movement for many years. He said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. So all of the features of the hive, the sort of infrastructure of the movement, are all dedicated to getting out a large subsection of the population to vote. And they are a minority of the population in our country. The evangelical pollster, George Barna, who's part of the various movement initiatives, but also does very good data, he identified the most sort of devoted religious right members, not just the ones who are voting the correct way, but also the ones who are knocking on doors and doing all the work to get out the vote. And he said they're only 10% of the population, but in 2016, 91% turned out to vote, and 93% of those who turned out to vote for Trump. And the numbers were actually even higher in 2020. So think about it. You got a country where 40 to 50% of people don't bother to turn out to vote. And a number of others have their votes sort of basically essentially stolen from them through gerrymandering, voter suppression, and the like. You don't need a majority of the population to dominate in election cycles. All you need is a disproportionately committed minority that is turning out to vote in disproportionate numbers. So all of this, so again, this, I think interfaith work is incredibly important. I think it's really important for faith leaders to stand up and work together and say, this doesn't represent us. This is, we do not want to live in a society where, our faith has something to do with loving our neighbors, ourselves, and treating one another with empathy rather than targeting certain subgroups for contempt and ramming, unpopular bills through state gerrymandered state legislatures. You know, that's really important for folks to do. But at the same time, the problem is a political problem, and some of the solutions are going to be political as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine. Let's see, I want to address so many of the points, but I think let's go quickly through everyone else as well. If Wei, would you care to jump on the question as well?
Sure. I think it's a great question, and Catherine has actually covered some of the key elements of the solutions of these problems. I think I also agree that the nationalism and promoting the radical forms of nationalism is a political problem. It's not a social problem, actually. It's a political problem because it's most of the time it's drive from the political actors, from the actors and bodies that want to manipulate the politics and want to hold the power. So it's come from that motive in most cases, and therefore it's a political problem. It has to be addressed in such manner as well. For faith-based organizations or any other organizations, I think working with the community, changing public mindset, opinion can only do so much. At the end of the day, you have to tackle this as a political problem, and you have to be able to address the policies that promote this agenda, or the nationalism, and the practices, the structure that enable this nationalism, and that practices that promote them. And these are key issues. At the same time, if it's become radical, if it's become but it's become a violent form of nationalism, and if it's harming the individuals or group, and then the perpetrators of those crimes must be held accountable, and the impunity for these people should be end. I think that's a very important element. In Myanmar, what we have been doing and what I have seen other people have been doing is it's similar, but it's sometimes in a society is undemocratic, if society is repressive, if it's even more difficult to actually do or counter this issue, the nationalism itself, or racism, if we say so. We in the past 10 years, we have very limited space, and because our society and the political structure is quite repressive, we have very limited space, as I said, and limited resources. Yet we were trying to tackle the issue, approach the issue from the different approaches. One, bottom-up approach, and second, the top-down approach. When we say top-down approach, it's about changing the policy and practices and structures. And when we say bottom-up, it's about changing from the people, by educating people, engaging with the people. When we engage with the people, we engage quite vertically across the young people. Our specific focus was young people, but also we engage with civil society actors, journalists, academics, and religious leaders. That's what my organizations have been doing. Through the trainings, through the forum, through the workshops, and bringing the people together to counter hate and racism, discriminations, or by promoting campaign, like, for example, my friend campaign, which was a social media campaign, taking selfie with your friend from different religion, and posting them on the social media by appreciating or by commenting their positive impact on you. And we have a hashtag called friendship has no boundaries. So basically, it was a very strategic approach in a very repressive society when you cannot even call it nationalism, or when you cannot even name it as racism. You can't use those words. You have to find a way to change the mindset and attitude of the people outside and online. So that's what we were doing, like trying to play very safe, yet addressing some of the key divisions within the community, hate and fears of others, so-called others. So that's what we are trying to address. And I have seen other organizations doing similar work and there are some other organizations, especially the faith-based organizations and religious leaders came together to try to showcase that they can work together and educate people that the religions are not threat against each other, they can coexist. There are messages that other organizations are doing as well. One thing that I have noticed when it's come to religious leaders is that if it is not very influential actors, if it is not a very influential or popular religious leader, the effort by the religious leaders might not necessarily tackle that core of the problem, because often when religious leaders come together, they come from the place, their approach is often finding commonality and work from it. They necessarily don't cover or address or touch the difficult or the divided narrative, because they don't want to create more divisions when they come together, right? It's often like finding commonality among this and good commonality, and then they work from it, through it. So that's where I find like when there are a lot of interfaith organizations led by religious leaders are not effective. Therefore, but I also believe that these are important, but at the same time, we also need to have institutions, organizations, civil society organizations tackling the root causes of this nationalism, the drivers of the nationalisms, and we need to approach it in a way addressing a political issue.
Thank you, Wei Wei. I'm really glad that you brought up that point about addressing the political issues and the policies, because, as Saurav has mentioned, and Catherine as well, yes, as practitioners or as authors or journalists as yourself, we really need to understand the context and the drivers behind nationalism and the reasons why and why we're seeing it grow or develop, and why these communities or why not these. And all of that is so fascinating and interesting, but especially for the work that we do, to your point, we really do need, there's some point where it does become an institutional question, where it becomes a policy question, where it becomes, a matter of maybe a higher level. The work that we do as NGOs and CSOs will always be valuable and needed to address kind of the more grassroots and communal practices that we see, but there needs to be higher assistance. There needs to be a force also backing us to, prevent recidivism is a term that we use, or to prevent the rise or the growth of nationalism even further. So I really appreciate your question. If we had so much more time, I'd really like to hear everyone's thoughts on this question of policy and the higher level approach that governments have in this. But all of that to say, actually, Ray, would you be able to tackle kind of the solutions question that everyone's been speaking to for the moment? And then Panuga, you as well.
Yes, I have the solution to this perennial and enormous complicated issue. I mean, I'm just joking, but I mean, it's hard. It really is. I think some avenues have been teased out already, right? Taking top-down, bottom-up approach. And that is because I think on the one hand, yes, that this is a leadership-driven move. These movements are leadership driven, and that there is the end goal for a lot of these individuals driving the hate and this kind of nationalistic rhetoric. What's in it for them? It's power, and holding on to that power. But then from a discursive studies approach, these discursive generators are part of an environment. And so there's like a feedback loop, right? So when people say something and they get the positive response or the response that they were expecting, they're inclined to keep saying that. So there is an element of like how the environment is also feeding back into what these people are saying, right? So perhaps that is an avenue for faith-based organizations working on the ground, where you try to inoculate their base from certain kinds of messaging. And so because people will naturally change their tune if they realize that those talking points no longer work, right? Politicians are great at this. This is why they flip-flop on so many issues. They'll go one way, they'll vote one way, and then they'll vote the other way because they realize that their base has changed. And that's kind of the fear in a lot of the politicians' mind as well, that their demographic is changing and they don't know what to do about it. So they put in this whole great replacement fear thing about like it, but we have to understand, like, they don't really care about their base. It's more like my voting block is disappearing and they're worried about that. Well, that's the thing where I think faith-based initiatives, local initiatives on the ground can do some powerful work to discourage and vote people out, right? And like, this may be very unpalatable for certain churches and certain religious organizations that want to be apolitical. I understand that. And so, you know, when you run into that kind of wall, gentle coaxing, I think impressing upon the kind of the gravity of the situation, you know, I think that's all you can do, because you can't force anyone to vote, you know. And so if that's their stance, then that is their stance. And if that's their principle, then they stand by that principle, and so be it. There are other instances when I think someone in the question box asked, you know, like, what if people are hesitant because, you know, there's a certain level of self-preservation, right? Worry of self-preservation. And we're seeing that in the US. Many pastors have had to shutter their doors because they spoke out or they said something one way or the other, and half their congregation left and went down the street to the other congregation or joined another church or just never went back to that church, right? So in an environment where in the US, which is kind of like a religious marketplace where, you know, the consumer of a religious faith tradition is free to change their patronage whenever without any consequences, it's really hard for faith leaders to speak out, right? And I've spoken to many pastors who want to be prophetic and bold and say, like, I want to call that out, but if I do, I will be out of a job and I have no way of providing for my family. And like, that's a real concern. And I think for peace building organizations such as, you know, ourselves, like, you know, when we want to work with communities like this, it is understanding not just their needs, but then the constraints in these communities, and then trying to come up with creative solutions to address them as best as possible.
Thank you. And I'm glad you brought up that point about you know, the pastors and, you know, the self-preservation fear that also comes in there, because it's very understandable. It's, you know, human, and as being a faith or peace building organizations ourselves, we also have to have a gentleness and grace to, you know, respecting everyone's boundaries and where they are comfortable. And Panuga, quickly, and we'll go to you, and then I think that we'll just read out a few of the comments and answer some participant Q&A quickly. And I know you're all busy, so I will try not to take too much of your time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be very short as well, because a lot has been already said, and that is kind of tying back to what I also wanted to add out. But I think one thing that's very specific to the French context, and also maybe the European context as well, is that I mentioned it a bit before, is that peace building and also countering nationalist rhetorics or tendencies, policies is not seen as a priority, or it's slowly becoming one, but it's not yet put as at the forefront as something very, very important or urgent to deal with. But there is an urgency, there's a need to address it. And so in terms of funding, but also, again, as you were saying, a political will to address this issue. And peace building doesn't seem to be urgent in a democratic framework, but we are witnessing a slide into more gradually more authoritarian, or at least restrictive or regressive political structure that primarily affects minority communities. So there needs to be a shift in terms of how do we perceive this whole situation. And again, it ties back to what you were saying in terms of it's a political issue, so it also has to be dealt with political actors as well. In terms of maybe more concrete kind of actions that can be put forward, and our strategies that we can put forward is keep providing safe space for interfaith dialogue for youth and empowering them and becoming peace leaders. So Cohesive State's partly doing that, but it has proven effective, and we mostly need those volunteers to keep working in that direction. And also keep reinforcing each organization's internal tools, like what they were doing and what has been proven most effective in terms of research or in terms of educational objectives. So that's very important in terms of showing the legitimacy of that work, but also the validity of those actions given the context that we're evolving in. And also kind of tying back to what was said before by Weiwei as well, in terms of social media engagement, that providing verified information, social media campaigns is also an effective tool to kind of counter hateful rhetorics that are on social media and also taken or are used much more by nationalist spheres as well. And in a more maybe advocacy or more like organizational level, coalition building and advocacy work towards other organizations or MEPs or institutions, also a way to slowly make them understand that this is an issue that needs to be raised very quickly and needs more funding. And so having that kind of discussion with political power when possible is also another way to kind of raise that issue and also respond to this phenomenon as well.
Merci. Everyone, these have been really, really wonderful, and I quite like that this question came up because sometimes you get into webinars and you get into really theory heavy discussions, and it's like peace builders. It's really nice to have like concrete, let's call them pathways. Solutions is a hard word for this. I don't think any of us have the full solution for how to counter nationalism in our countries, but thank you all for sharing like really concrete steps forwards and great things to think about. And I think Weiwei's internet might have cut out, so hopefully we will get her back shortly. But Saurabh had also posted this in question in the chat, to ask our participants what their organizations were doing to kind of work on how do we speak to nationalism as a peace building organization. And if I may, I was hoping to read a few, since we're all being recorded anyways, just so that you all can hear what everyone else is doing. One of our participants, Joseph, said, KCID is interreligious and intercultural dialogue for peace. Peace work, particularly interfaith dialogue, is getting increasingly difficult in Nigeria, mainly because of the presence of the current government to promote or patronize two religious groups in the country. And so, there's a lot of division. There's a lot of division in the point of national elections. To our point about politics and policies, how do governments react when there's key events that come in, like elections, and how we've seen Macron, we've seen Le Pen, we're now seeing with Joseph in Nigeria. And so how do you build that bridge on interreligious and intercultural dialogue to, kind of counter all of those things? I'm sorry, I'm looking at the same time. Someone else, Jared, I believe if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, I believe from the Minnesota Council of Churches, we're also more intentionally seeking ways to foster community amongst faith leaders across inter-Christian theological divides, which is very interesting, and across religious boundaries. For example, regular meetings where top religious leaders in mainline Christian, evangelical Christian, and rabbinical groups, which state public officials staff with state public health staff, and creating shared problem-solving space for cross-sector institutional COVID responses. Those are some really concrete means of engagement, especially along theological lines, having different groups come in and actually, say, along theory and biblical writings, what it is, how they can engage in conversation. And I think one more that I wanted to highlight, Michelle was responding to the question saying, is exploring one thing I'm exploring with partners is bringing faith-based adaptations of conflict sensitivity previously developed to test in other countries into the US context. So with the caveat that it works mainly with audiences that hold good intentions, which arguably some actors in the context, depending on how people want to be challenged in their views and beliefs, you may get different interactions with that. But we'll try and bring some more to the front, but a lot of people have responded to the same question that you all did about what their organizations are bringing to the table, which is really interesting. And thank you all for doing that. And Saurabh, did you want to maybe go through and do a question or two? I don't know how much time you all have or are willing to give.
We have like 7 minutes, so I will try and go through some of the questions. I'm really sorry and apologize that we couldn't get more in, but let me just start with some in the Q&A. Maybe I can take a couple and then maybe we can address this. But Ryan says, hey, thank you all for sharing. Ryan here, PhD student in communications with a focus on peace communications. Since so many conflicts involve very deeply held, often religious beliefs, it feels like it feels that most peace-building efforts must engage directly with those beliefs. However, have you found any productive ways, communication practices, policy approaches, etc., of promoting peace that doesn't require entering into a thick of debates about the nuances of the beliefs involved? That's a great question. I think Wei already gave such a brilliant little campaign as an answer, but like, yeah, and that campaign harks to something called values-based messaging. I think finding messages that are common to everyone. One of them, I mean, nobody will deny messages that we believe in dignity of all, right? So it's like, I think values-based messaging is, I would want to make a case for that, but I would love everyone's thoughts on that too, if you could answer that question.
Well, I just
What do you
wanted
think? What do you think? I might take Lena's question as well, Lena's comments as you think, just so that I give you some time to think. So Lena says, thank you for this enlightening webinar. The Lebanese case of nationalism is multifaceted with many critically intertwined elements that are increasingly affecting the very existence of the country. My question to the panelists is, how can we effectively include and empower religious leaders, Christian, Jews, and Muslims to be active agents of change with a peace-building focus and agenda? In Islam, there is no separation of religion from state. The role of religious leaders is apolitical on the table and definitely very political under the table. So thank you. Two very hard questions, difficult questions, but yeah, feel free to chime in to those.
I will respond to the first question that was asked about values-based messaging. And I think it's important, and I think that's a really great framing. And I think someone in the chat box also talked about like, and I responded briefly about like, can we build, is there optimism for a common future that can be built, right, collectively? And I think, yeah, instead of trying to counter message hate, just redirect towards something positive. Yeah, that can definitely be an effective strategy. I would just warn that in many instances over the decades, I think there's been an assumption that there is a universal understanding of human rights or the understanding of what human is and what counts as human dignity. And I think we're seeing that with some kind of the deadlock that's happening in the United Nations and some of their initiatives, and people who work in the UN and, that I've spoken to, they're like, yeah, like it's kind of like one of those elephants in the room that we don't ask. Like, it's just kind of the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was crafted by certain people with a certain kind of educational background, with a certain kind of worldview. And they said, this is what's going to be the boilerplate standard for the rest of the world. Unfortunately, when the rubber meets the road and you try to implement that, you can get a lot of resistance to, and it feeds into the whole like, oh, here's the West again trying to teach us about what it means to be good people, right? And there's a lot of resistance there, especially in countries that have a history of colonialism, Western colonialism in particular. And so I think it's very important to kind of, yes, that is a great approach, but let's not fall into the assumption that there is a universal like human understanding of human rights and an appreciation for specific things. And then it's more important to allow each community to speak, right, about what are their values and then run from there instead of kind of superimposing. And I don't think that's what you meant to imply, Saurav. These are just the thoughts that immediately come to mind, right? And something that we should all kind of remind ourselves periodically because it's easy to forget. And so I would say, yeah, like, and sometimes you're going to meet some interesting problems where there are going to be irreconcilable differences about what a good future is first, like, and you're going to have some hard discussions about, well, a good future for this community is one in which that community doesn't exist. And like, what do you do about that, right? Like, and these are real questions that are being wrestled with on the ground right now, still to this day. And so, there are no easy answers to that. And I think it's just a matter of continuing to listen deeply, continuing to question our own assumptions and what worked previously and assuming that's going to continue to work. And I think it's about always unlearning and relearning. And that's like the best, the best I got right now.
That's a great answer, Ray, because I think you helped Lena answer her question as well, as she notes in the chat. Well, through Gustav, who's also active in the chat. But anybody else have any thoughts or reflections on that, and just thoughts and reflections on the conversation in general? I would really appreciate any last words.
Can I just say a few words? I might not turn on the video, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I think it is important to understand the nature of the conflict, or nationalism, or the movement that we're dealing with, and also understand the drivers, as you were saying earlier, drivers of this movement. If my understanding is that if the movement is like existing social divisions and prejudice, nationalism based on that, it's more socially driven nationalism than it's I mean, and that's perhaps connected to the religion and race, and then the leaders, the religious leaders, and the community leaders, role of community leaders and religious leaders are very important. There are ways that they could approach, and often, if in most cases, values-based approach work. In some cases, they don't, because the values doesn't. Values are not same for every religious group or every communities they're dealing with, so they may not work. But I think what could work is that to have openness, to find common humanity, and besides religion, for religious leaders to teach their followers to be open to diversity, to be open to differences. I think that's the only message will work well. Otherwise, all other approaches needs to be carefully approached. But if the conflict, or not the conflict, I mean, if the movement is driven by the political actors, but then I don't believe that the only religious leaders will be able to address this issue, because at the end of the day, it has to be done through the political approach, and the policies. Unless the policies and practices are changed, the effort by the civil society actors or the religious leaders might not be as effective as we want to see. And that was the example, the case in Burma as well. There were efforts by the religious leaders, by the civil society, but because the policies and the driving forces were coming from a bigger place, with a better resource institutions and individual, and it wasn't enough to counter it. It wasn't, the effort was not as effective as we want to see, because these policy hasn't changed, and the perpetrators of this incitement were not held accountable. And therefore, I think we need to be able to address the policies issues, impunity issues, and at the same time, I guess, at the end of the day, if people buy in those propaganda, and at the end of the day, it's always people that involved in this movement. And at some point, if we are able to change mindset of the people, maybe the policy will change at the end, but it will take longer anyway. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, if it is a more socially driven movement, then it might be easier to just focus in on the people, to change mindset and to build peace between the communities. But if it is coming from the top, then you have to have a multiple approach, and you really need to be able to tackle policies as well, while we need to invest in the people.
Awesome. Thank you, Wei Wei. I realize we're like 4 minutes past. We call this Nepali time because I'm from Nepal. When you go past a certain time, you're not on time. This is Nepali time. But thank you so much for spending extra 4 minutes with us. I just wanted to make a quick pitch for Catherine's book. Please, I put a link in the chat. If you are interested in learning more about Catherine's work, her book, I will put a link to bookshop.org for her book. Please, yeah, I think it's an excellent book. I haven't read myself, but I listened to a lot of podcasts where she was speaking, so I'm definitely going to go and buy it. But Melis, I don't know if you want to take it away.
No, I think our panelists have more than covered, everything that's been mentioned. We're really appreciative for you all to have come out, and I realize that we're over time, so I will keep it short. But to a lot of people's points, we are planning, AFP and ICRD are planning on hosting some more events in the future, to be determined on the subjects of what. But as soon as we do, we'd love to invite you all again and to share it with your networks. And please, by all means, on religious interfaith peace building, we'd love to have you all participate again. And thank you to our panelists for sharing really such insightful comparisons and, contexts and solutions to these issues that we're seeing in the world today. And I think that we've had a really meaningful and useful conversation. So I appreciate all of you for coming out. And I will also drop my email in the chat box if you all need anything or want to reach out to any of the panelists for after the event.
Thank you, Melis, and thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
Priyanka.
much.
Thank you, Catherine. Sorry we didn't get to get your final words. I really apologize about that. But we really appreciate your time.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, and I'm very happy to hear from the fellow panelists, and grateful to all of you.
Awesome. I'm going to stop recording. I think folks are